Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another great episode of Mind Matters, Navigating Head Injuries and Concussions. I'm your host, Kylie Como, and I'm the legal nurse consultant here at Shane Smith Law. Today, I'm speaking with Paula Walters. She's a veteran paramedic, a trauma survivor, and a really passionate advocate for change, whose own journey from surviving abuse and its devastating after effects took her to being a voice that inspires others to transform pain into purpose. Paula, it's really good to see you again today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the work that you guys are doing in giving people like me a platform to kind of help others understand.
Yeah, we're glad you're here. No doubt about it. So if any of you have tuned into our podcast before, then you know that our focus here is to discuss all things traumatic brain injury. And so with that, Paula, we're going to jump right in. Okay, Paula, so we've seen really a sharp rise in chronic illnesses, mental health struggles, addiction, and even early deaths in America. Can you explain how maybe unresolved trauma, especially talk about childhood trauma, might be kind of a hidden root cause behind some of these growing health crises?
So people think of trauma is kind of really just in the mind type of thing, like that it's just like, oh, it's an emotional thing, when really it physically alters brain development, your nervous system regulation, and really the autoimmune disorders. It takes a toll on the immune system. And so I know I was born in the 70s, and in my lifetime, childhood chronic illnesses went up 400%. And so when we start thinking about all the trauma, we've seen domestic violence numbers went up. We've seen the human trafficking, the sexual molestation, and all these different trauma things. And really, honestly, just things like the bullying in school and social media, there's more violence. TV, trauma is chronically there. It's always in our life. So we have these people and these kids and who have done all this trauma, and they've had all this trauma, and we've been taught to stuff. We don't talk about it. It makes people uncomfortable. People start having these things that start showing up as ADHD, autism. We start having these kids who have all these allergies. You start having eczema, kids who have abdominal pain, and they go from diarrhea to constipation. And, we have a lot of POTS, neurocardiogenic syncope. So it's all of these medical diagnoses that people are chasing disorders. I know I myself from 2006 to 2019 had over $500,000 in medical debt. I saw over 50 different providers chasing all of these medical problems, these symptoms that I kept having. And then they would send you to a different, these doctors come in and you make an appointment, you're seen for 10 minutes. They order a test and give you a medicine. And then before you know it, so like for me, I kept getting sicker and sicker, started getting more diagnosis. Over this 13-year period I'm on almost 24 medications. And now I have, almost a dozen medical diagnoses. And so we see these increasing numbers of fibromyalgia, Crohn's, IBS, POTS, neurocardiogenic syncope, and these very vague symptoms or very vague diagnosis that can, are costly. And I mean, it's not just costing us on the medical side of things, but people missing work, and what that takes a toll on the employment and all of these things. When we think trauma and we think it's very easy, but I mean, it is so much bigger than that. And it is taking a toll on our medical system because we are one of the most, we are spending a lot of money in healthcare, and people are getting sicker. And people are dying younger and younger and younger. And when you start going back and you ask these people, and I'm intrusive, which I shouldn't probably be, but I'll ask people about, especially when I have them back in the ambulance, I'll be like, hey, have you ever had any trauma in your life? And it's funny how so many of them will say yes, but nobody's putting it together.
I don't know if I'd call that intrusive, Paula, to be honest with you. I think we've talked about, I hope our audience has seen some of our other interviews with you where you've advocated, digging in like that, being vulnerable ourselves. So I applaud you for doing that, because as you just mentioned there, you're able to surface those things, and that probably starts them down that track of maybe actual healing when they can start verbalizing those things. Can you think of, were there particular moments or maybe even health issues in your own life that made you kind of connect the dots to unresolved trauma, and how might that have changed your approach to healing?
The funny thing is, I'm a paramedic and I've worked in trauma centers, yet I never put it together myself. I just happened to get in front of the right doctor who, kind of said, I don't think you have all of this stuff. I think you have a brain injury. So he was looking at the brain injury symptoms, but it wasn't really until I got, to seeing Dr. Eric Reese and Dr. Mike Hennis, which, you've had their clinic on your podcast, where it got put together. So we're looking at, 2020, 2021, when I started in 2006, and I have all these medical problems before, that whole trauma piece and how it changed my brain. And that's just because I happened to get in front of functional medicine doctors. And we know that a lot of people can't afford to get there. But I was at rock bottom. And then I learned the very dangerous intersection where you get the mental health, the physical stuff, the suicide and addictions, like all of that going together. But that's because I had a doctor who created a safe space for me to talk about my childhood and being able to bring that up. Because people don't normally just bring that up to their doctors. But I had a doctor who, I don't even know if they're actually trauma informed, but they do treat the whole person. And they did ask some of the right questions. And it really opened up this huge window that I just kept opening and opening and opening. And here we are, because I keep chasing it. I still have new memories from my childhood that come up every so often when I'm speaking, something that I had totally forgot about. Wow. That I have to relive something, and it starts this big cascade of feelings. And then I have to go through this emotional dysregulation and unpack that. And that's very hard to people to navigate if they don't understand how trauma impacts their body.
Boy, you said I could go down so many rabbit trails with that. Absolutely. I think what I got there at the end was you attacked it, right? You didn't try to run from those memories that come up, right? So you dove into that, but you did. That's not our natural response. You've had to learn that, and getting connected to the right provider, like you said, Dr. Reese, and yes, please, audience, go back to some of our other episodes where we've had Dr. Reese on, just an amazing provider, practitioner. You said it, just getting in front of the right people that know what they're doing, understand issues like you're addressing here, can make literally a world of difference. With that, Paula, why is it that so many survivors, of trauma, develop these physical illnesses? Talking about that mind-body connection, right? Like these autoimmune diseases, heart disease, chronic pain. So much later in life, you have these, ACEs, these childhood experiences. What's the connection between that trauma and the body breaking down?
Well, so, over time, so when we have trauma, we have our feel-good chemicals. So like our dopamine, our serotonin, our oxytocin, our endorphins, who are meant to help our body. So they kind of diminish pain, that kind of make us feel good, give us the ability to want to go do stuff, motivation. So those get kind of dampened. And then you have that cortisol, and you have your adrenaline and noradrenaline that go up. Well, cortisol takes a toll. It takes a toll on your sleep. It takes a toll on your immune system. And so over time, when you have all these chemicals going through your body, especially those stress hormones, it takes a toll on, the body being able to get all the gunk out. So it kind of slows down the liver. And I mean, even it breaks down even being able to get your skin. So I've been doing a lot of traveling lately. And I know when I woke up this morning, I have like huge bags under my eyes, and like my ankles are a little more swollen and my hands are a little more swollen. I know that my lymphatic system is overwhelmed because there's just been a lot of cortisol. I've told my story, several times over the last week and a half, but it's all that stress chemicals going through my body. Well, when I go to my doctor, he always tries to tell me, well, you've got some edema. We want to put you on Lasix. And he puts it up to that. So, and then here, if I take that, but I know what it is, and I need to, kind of like take some time and, work on some drainage pathways, but it's so easy to get them mislabeled. I think it's a very hard thing to understand because it's such a big, huge issue, and we're having to kind of narrow it down. And the lines are very blurry, medical, mental. And so you have all this stuff going through the body, and it takes a toll. It's kind of like running your car on dirt roads and stone roads and not taking care of it. If you didn't, if you're not changing your oil, you're not changing your tires, you're not, doing that maintenance, your car is going to break down for, after time. It's the same way with the body. You don't process all of that trauma and all those chemicals, it's going to take a toll on the body.
Absolutely. Yeah. You're talking about that inflammatory cascade. I mean, it's a domino effect. One thing leads to another, and it's very difficult to stop, especially, if you mentioned the experience with having, edema around the ankles, and, the go-to being that Lasix for, fluid overload. That's basic medical care, but that wasn't at all what it was related to. And so I love that you highlighted that. Can you talk about, and just this is for some of the folks that might be listening that think, I might have some of these things. What are some of those other biological changes, maybe that you experienced, or others that you've talked to experience, that occur in the body when you remain in that kind of prolonged state of stress, and how might, you talked about how those can contribute to autoimmune disorders or even heart disease, right? So what are some of the biological changes somebody might see?
I know some of the main symptoms that I would have is I had a lot of changes in my skin. I started having I would have really dry skin, or I started having a lot of acne. I started losing my hair. My hair was falling out all the time. And so because of my age, because I was in my late 40s, it was just chalked up to, you're perimenopausal, especially with the moodiness, the fatigue. But then one day I'm fine the next day. So the perimenopausal stuff. And then I would have a lot of heart palpitations. I was constantly having heart palpitations. I don't really like to talk about this one, but I started having a lot of more sweating, and I would get really bad BO. I had a really bad body odor, and I was like, what is going on? Also got chalked up to that whole, you got a hormonal shift. When what it really was, that whole, the lymphatic system getting backed up. And so here it's not that Lasix and that CHF thing going on. So it's all of those things. Being chronically ill, I was constantly having, and a lot of people do this, because the immune system's been beaten down, you're constantly getting, every time, the flu comes around, you're catching it. You might be getting, the COVID or the, norovirus, and it just allergies that you can take allergy pills, but you still have the symptoms because the immune system's just shot, in a lot of stomach stuff. And they kept telling me you're just a worrier. You got to quit stressing so much. So then they'd want to put me on, they gave me Xanax and they gave me Ativan because I was constantly sick, constantly having diarrhea or constipation, or I would throw up a lot. And they just say, well, you're stressed. You take things too seriously. You got to relax a little bit. When it was really all this gut stuff, because we know that trauma lives in the brain, but the gut is the second brain. So when you start learning that alignment, that usually if there's something going on in the brain, there's something going on in the gut. And I have not had any problems with that since I've kind of re-healed that stuff. Taking
it back to Dr. Reese, we've talked a lot about that mind, gut, body connection is just this fascinating triangle that again is such a deep well we could talk about. So I do appreciate you bringing that up. I'm certain that there are people out there listening or watching us saying, yes, I've got some of that, and hopefully it starts them thinking or asking questions to their provider, or talking about things maybe they didn't before, because now there is that connection in their mind. So thank you so much for that. Many people still think trauma is it's just a mental health issue. It's a mind matter, if you will, right? Can you help our audience maybe understand why trauma is actually that kind of, like we've been talking, that full body experience that really affects the brain and the physical health, and it often leads to misdiagnoses or missed opportunities for healing?
I think it's important for people to understand that trauma physically, so it's not just a mental thing, it physically rewires the brain. And so it's changing the brain structure and how the brain kind of changes the body. So it's really kind of like going in and changing your spark plugs around in your car, or messing with the carburetor and messing with, it runs the whole car. And if you mess that up, the whole thing's not going to run smoothly. It's kind of like the same thing with trauma. So you start getting the brain, and you're getting these processes that can't do what they're supposed to do or send messages down. So you have that vagus nerve that goes down to the gut, and that, those two go together, and just being able to how everything works together. And so it really does change hormonal, neurological, so you get something like the fight or flight kicking in, whether it's appropriate or not, sometimes it's out of context. And if people don't understand that, then it's oh, I'm having palpitations, I'm having chest pain. And so then you're going in to the doctor and you're having test after test after test chasing that. And so I think it's super important, because then you get these feelings that you can't control, or there's no rhyme or reason to them. So they give you a medicine, and it can actually even change you to where you don't ever feel good anymore. That does actually start taking a toll on your mental health. And that's where I think that we get into the people who want to feel something. So then you start people getting cutting or start going down the addictions hole and doing, a lot of self-harm or threatening self-harm, or people that start, it opens up a whole slippery slope to total body healing. So you really have to look at when you say trauma, it is head to toe, literally.
You're 100%. And you touched on basically what amounts to polypharmacy, and that, as you alluded to, creates a whole different slew of problems on top of that, and just muddies the waters even further, as you've been talking about. So not only creating more issues and more frustration for the victim, but I think frustration for the provider too, who's thinking, like you mentioned it prior to this question, these preconceived notions that they may have about patients. So it's just it's this vicious circle, if you will. So that's a great rundown. So I want to talk about, you mentioned early on in this discussion, with addictions and suicides on the rise, how important is it that we start viewing these struggles through that trauma-informed lens instead of just kind of labeling them as, these are just really tragic choices, right? Or maybe just moments of weakness.
So I tell people I became an addict for two different reasons. And I stay an addict for two different reasons. And I understand the root of it. But when people don't, they can use unhealthy addiction. So I have come to the conclusion and the realization and the acceptance that I will always be an addict. Right now, it's, I'll weave in and out of like work and food, sugar. But when you have this overwhelming trauma, so you don't even realize you have it, but you have that stuff going on in the brain that feels very overwhelming, because you have your fight or flight that makes you live up here. So you always feel on guard. And so as Bessel van der Kolk says, angry people live in angry bodies. And until you understand how your body feels and how it reacts in the world around you, you may feel constantly on edge. And so that makes you feel very on guard. And to kind of combat those feelings, it may be something first that you start drinking, or you might just be taking some pills. And then it's like you need more and more and more. Because I don't think that people understand like how trauma embodies itself in you, and to feel that constant, you talked earlier about how, take that moment. Like, I'm sure we can all close our eyes and think about this near fatal moment, or like whether we were in an accident, or whether, we were given some bad news about a loved one dying, just something that was just very life-changing. In that moment of how you felt, whether it was fear, anger, something. Now imagine feeling that all the time, 24/7, and you don't even know, because you don't have something happening at that moment. It lives in you from all these memories that you aren't even talking about. So now you want to calm that feeling, right? A lot of us in that moment of a loss, we may hug somebody, or we give support. But trauma victims can't do that. So what do they try to do? They might try to cut. They may try to have this overwhelming, I just want it to stop. So in that impulsive moment, because the prefrontal cortex has been damaged, so they can't really think with that rational brain. They're thinking with the emotional brain. So then they make that quick judgment to take their life, or to drive, a car into something, or they might try heroin for the first time, or fentanyl. And then all of a sudden now it's become an addiction. It's not that people, I don't think, search for that high. I never did. I was an alcoholic. I was a binge drinker, and I did a lot of like pill popping. And I did it because I just wanted this thing to stop. And nobody would tell me what this thing was, this feeling. I couldn't make it stop. And everybody told me it was in my head. Well, if it's in my head, I want it to stop. So I looked for ways to make it stop. Again, I think that we need people to understand that most people don't just all of a sudden wake up in their 20s and 30s and be like, I want to be an addict. That was never my goal growing up was, I want to be an addict. It was a way of survival for me and trying to quiet the storm that was brewing inside of me from something that I didn't even understand.
Yeah, I'm at a loss for words. Yeah, they quieting the storm. I think we're, especially in today's day and age, the society we live in, we're so bombarded and geared toward escapism and just wanting to avoid conflict and pain and all of that. And it's so much easier now, I think, to do that, grab that endorphin, that dopamine rush, to get away from that. So what a powerful kind of way to frame it in your own experience. Thank you so much. As we wrap, I kind of would like to know what you think, what changes do you believe we need, in healthcare systems, in our mental health approaches, even everyday conversations or, our places of employment, if we truly want to really address the root cause, behind this, America's, really, let's call it, just terrible health statistics.
So my advice to people, especially in the healthcare systems and stuff like that, has been, let's start part of our intake summaries, our intake questionnaire is make your own type of ACE score test just to kind of see. And if you do it right, to ask, things like about a home, and asking, was there ever an abuse, or asking those questions, all medical providers, or, you guys said something about you guys having the brain injury questionnaire. So start asking those questions about, like, have you ever been hit in the head? Have you ever lost, unconsciousness? Have you had unconsciousness? Stuff like that. It can be a car accident, a sport injury, but then at least gives us that, hey, is it everybody? No. But when we start having those questions like, man, Paula's she just doesn't seem like she's compliant with this treatment. She doesn't, she's constantly sick. Maybe it's not that it's in my head and I'm a hypochondriac, but maybe like, oh, look, hey, her ACE score was a 7 and she had a near fatal strangulation. Maybe we need to dig a little deeper. And so that we don't say those things like, my gosh, we see you all the time, or, hey, you've missed 2 appointments. We're not gonna be able to see you anymore. Because there's, law offices, there's medical providers, there's healthcare providers, social work, that if you miss appointments, you're fired. Maybe there's a little more leniency. So I think that we need to start having those questions and make them part of your everyday practice. It needs to be a standard. And if everybody, if you get 10 clinics that start making it a standard, and then all of a sudden it's a 20 or 30, maybe in 5 years, that's something that we talk about all the time. And now it's no longer shameful to say, like, hey, I had a bad childhood. And, and we need to stop the whole thing of, well, what happened in your childhood can't possibly impact you today. Like, you're 50 years old. What are you doing? Like, what happened to you at 5? Can't possibly. We need to stop those conversations. And I think that trauma-informed leadership who holds their employees accountable to that, and not judge. Because it really does impact every part of our life. When you start looking, the Strangulation Institute talks about mass shooters, and they have mass killers, but one thing in common, childhood trauma. So clearly, when we start talking about how trauma impacts our lives, it impacts all of us. Kids these days are doing school shooter drills. Well, it's usually tied to childhood trauma. So we kind of have to change those conversations and do early intervention. And we have to have compassionate care. And we need to start talking about those holistic healing models and starting treating the person and not just the diagnosis.
Do you feel like there's working in healthcare myself, spent a lot of years in the hospital setting, and we do have those screeners, right? Those abuse screeners. I think and I would wonder if you agree, there's a stigma even to asking those questions. There's a fear. There's like you're encroaching, or I don't know. There's just something uncomfortable about it. So do you feel like it's more just getting it out into the mainstream and making it, I don't know if it's comfortable, but just normal to have those conversations, especially in the emergency rooms, in healthcare settings like that, right? That's kind of more where you're advocating for, right?
Right. Well, and then, so the other so here's one of the other things is, I know a lot of times healthcare asks, do you feel safe at home? Well, what's the definition of safe? I never realized until adulthood really, the first time I realized was 2015, 4 years after my dad had died, that my home was very horrible. And I had an ACE score of 9. I would have never thought that my home was one of those homes. Because to me, that was normal. So when we say safe, maybe we need to start having some of those definitions differently. Abuse.
Wow.
Is anyone hurting you? It's no different than what I've been doing for the last 10 years. It's what I've been going through. So it's changing some of those questions. Because safe is in the eyes of the beholder.
Yeah, that is great. You just kind of opened my eyes to, just looking at it a little differently, right? Just the same old, but yeah, definitions matter. That is a powerful point. Thank you, Paula, very much. Well, that's going to do it for another episode of Mind Matters, Navigating Head Injuries and Concussions. Again, I want to thank Paula Walters for joining us today and sharing her expertise and passion with us. Again, look for her website, The Courageous Survivor, for more about her story and get some links to her other great content. I hope that our audience has enjoyed this really insightful and thought-provoking discussion as much as I have, and you're walking away with a deeper understanding and really an appreciation of what recovering and living and truly thriving with a brain injury is all about. Please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel to keep up with our latest and greatest content. And leave us a comment and let us know what you thought of today's discussion. And as always, remember, if you're in pain, call Shane at 980-999-9999. Take care.
In pain, so I call Shane. 980-999-9999. In pain, call Shane.